Buenas tardes a todos y a todas, espero estén muy bien.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you're all well. My name is Daniel Gomez. I'm a lawyer and I'm co-founder of Acción Jurídica, and I'm going to be joining you as a moderator in this event on challenges of tax policy for the materialization of racial equality in Latin America. This event has been promoted by the Initiative on Principles and Guidelines on Human Rights and Tax Policy and Legal Extraction and the Center for Economic and Social Rights. To me, it is an honor to be with you today, and we are going to have a luxury panel by capable people, interesting people in their perspective on the topics that we will be addressing. First of all, I'd like to remind you this initiative. The idea behind this event is to share to public environment a situation that haven't been addressed enough, and how it is necessary to include in tax policy and the execution of tax policy a perspective of racial environment, so that the subordinate historical groups and marginalized that have differential effects and impacts, to be able to include them when decision making in everything related to tax policies. Now, in a world of pandemic and post-pandemic, there is a risk of tax situations. So in order to prevent the negative effects that the pandemic has caused, will make it important to have an eco-racial point of view in deciding on tax policy and public spending matters. So in this sense, it is also important to remember basically two elements. The first one is the need of always remembering racism and discrimination as a structural problem of Latin American societies and in the Americas in general. The way in which even today, despite having many years gone by from the elimination of slavery as a formal institution throughout the region, Afro-descending populations are still having this unfavorable quality of life that non-Afro-descending people have, especially people from both origins. And it is also important to remember that when we talk about racial discrimination, it is important to remember its institutionalized character, the way in which it is not only a situation characterized by interpersonal relationships, but also it has to do with the way in which institutions, the state, including the tax policy, takes and it's full of these discrimination and racial inequality situations. It's important to add that today in Colombia, we are celebrating the Day of Colombianity, which is very important in this country. And basically what it does is celebrating the formal elimination of slavery as a legal institution in Colombia that happened in 1851 through Law 21 of May 21st that year. And it was institutionalized in the country throughout the law of 2001. What it did was formally assigning the Day of Colombianity. As it has been mentioned, Afro-descending populations in Latin America are facing enormous challenges in many topics. For example, access to higher education of quality, problems related to enjoyment of environmental rights, especially a right to a healthy environment, discrimination, both racial and intersectional in terms of gender or sexual orientation, people with disabilities, etc. High levels of police violence, and in the case of Colombia, we're seeing more and more in the scenarios of the protests that have a lot to do with this tax reform that Iván Duque's management has promoted. And last but not least, respect and guarantee of cultural rights and of recognition of Afro-descending populations. So in this context of vulnerability and social expulsion that sets the place and the position that Afro-descending populations have in the region. So it is important to have this opportunity to discuss tax policies, because at the end of the day, and the way the guidelines and principles have defended the warranty of rights, it is necessary to have a robust tax policy that allows to have the right resources to be able to materialize rights. In this sense, the principles and guidelines document on human rights and tax policy emphasizes on the need for tax policy of the states to not be only based in the efficient considerations or in economic considerations, but for it to take into account and have as a basis and foundation human rights principles. And in, of course, and having its realization to be a clear and main goal of tax policy in all states. I also want to remind you that this guideline document focuses on trying to specify what are some of the elements that states should consider, as well as non-state players, for example, multilateral institutions, as well as companies of the private sector, in order to reach a tax policy that respects human rights. This in a context, as it has been previously mentioned, these two situations appear to be disconnected in the region. In Latin America, human rights and tax policy appear to be in different directions. They are separately, and this is why the initiative aims to bring these worlds closer so that tax policy can materialize and realize these human rights based on historical matters, on the development of human rights as a result of non-discrimination participation, the use of the maximum available resources for materialization of rights, and once again, inclusion of state actors and non-state actors, for example, those who are part of governance, financial global governance. So this is just an introduction, and there are some presentations that are going to be illustrative on how the relationship is between tax policy and human rights. So clearly, it should consider, on behalf of decision makers, multilateral and unilateral ones, should consider. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce participants so we can continue with their presentation. So first of all, we have Fabiana del Popolo. She is going to be talking about economic gaps and visibilities and statistics of Afro-descendant community in Latin America. We also have Professor Carlos Biafara, that's going to talk about Code 19. We also have Sofia Garzon, that's going to talk about the role that Afro-descendant community plays in designing tax policy, especially one that is transforming and based on human rights. And we also have Lina Andrade, that's going to talk about structural topics, policies of racial equality in different environments such as education, employment, access to housing, among many others. So this is a brief introduction. Fabiana, now I pass the floor to you so that you can start the conversation, please. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Danielle. Good day, everyone. And I'd like to thank the Center for Economic and Social Rights. Thank you for this effort on the topic that we'll be discussing today. During these 10 minutes, I'm going to share visibility processes that we've had in terms of statistics for Afro-descending communities in Latin American countries. And I will also discuss the information that very gradually we've been receiving in the region for these last couple of years. First of all, we need to consider that the information is a very powerful tool for human rights promotion and even for promoting the materialization of these rights, as Daniel very well said. Information, of course, is very important for design, monitoring of public policy, but also we should consider the political component that information has, and that in some ways what allows Afro-descending organizations to exercise control efforts against the states which affects them. It is also very important to very quickly say that in the history of our region, neighborhood census, even the one of the first years of states nations, included questions on origin and race. But of course, it did not aim social justice, not racial equality, but they aimed to count forced labor and slave labor. Actually, there were census during on neighborhoods that, as a result, and what these results showed in terms of population growth, whether it was African or Afro descendant, caused that there was whitening activities. So when states, nations finished consolidating this history of subordination and slavery of Afro-descending communities and facing the ideology of people from two origins, and these assimilationists ideas, then Afro-descending communities disappeared. The only countries that kept in some instruments, such as census, questions about it were Brazil and Cuba, that until today are still keeping the same questions that they had during colonial times. So, this is why statistical visibilization expressed also conveyed another dimension of discrimination towards Afro-descending communities. Of course, Afro-descending struggles never ceased, and any sociopolitical changes that were generated in the last decades made that, along with these sociopolitical changes, where some of the main topics is the Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Intolerance at Durban 2001. Along with this political fight, the demand for information grew. Hence, we may say that visibility in terms of statistics is placed in the public agenda basically in this century. And this was important to mention because today different instruments of human rights and regional international agreements have included data disaggregation and Afro-descending information. So just for you to have an idea of 1980s census, only 2 countries had questions that allowed identifying Afro-descending population. And as I said before, they said Brazil and Cuba. So in 1990, Colombia was added to 1993 census. And recently in 2000, this inflection point was created where 9 countries of the region introduced identification questions. And census of 2010 happened in 14 countries, and we have considered that in this 2020 census round that hopefully will be carried out. I mean, you know that with the pandemic, countries have delayed the census efforts. However, most of the countries have considered starting census efforts between 2022 and 2023. And we have considered that 18 out of the 20 Latin American countries already have Afro-descending self-identification in all of their census. This, of course, could appear to be little, but if we consider a historical perspective, in these last 20 years, we have this important quantitative leap, where one of the main challenges that we have in the region are how to improve quality of information. And very quickly, I just want to add that, of course, census for Afro-descending communities were constituted in the main source of information of struggle, because as you very well know, this is the only instrument of universal character that could tell us how many this community holds. And I'm sure that this instrument, when defining a tax policy, will allow knowing not only how many of them they are, but also where they are, and how to distribute towards municipalities or towards different geographical areas of a country public resources. Also, thinking in electoral ballots. I mean, census are very important to know this volume and this percentage. So, of course, since census are done every 10 years, it's not the only source of information that we should consider. And in this sense, at the ECLAC, I work at the population division where we have been fostering and promoting these topics for almost 20 years. We insist that in all of the national statistical system, we need to have Afro-descending self-determination. So countries have gradually included this self-determination in surveys, which are very important for monitoring inequalities years after year so we can know poverty levels, what's happening with employment, and many other dimensions that are kind of support type of activities. And in the last studies that we did at the CLAC that we launched last year, unfortunately, we were only able to have information from the 20 countries of Latin America, only to have a region information, among them Colombia, but it was for less than half of the countries. So here we have a lot to do, and that does not only happen with self-identification questions, but also samples, how to process information and disaggregate it. And third of all, we have administrative records such as vital statistics, health statistics, education statistics, and so on and so forth. So here we also have a very important stagnancy of having self-identification in the records. And this, of course, hinders being able to monitor, as I said, progressiveness of human rights, being able to design public policies and being able to implement affirmative action policies. Because we have insisted at ECLAC that universal policies, yes, they are very important. However, they are not enough to reduce gaps to the extent where studies show that Uruguay, for example, yes, Afro-descending population in Uruguay is way better compared to Afro-descending information from other countries. It is also true that relative inequalities, relative gaps in Uruguay are still one of the deepest in the region. And this shows that affirmative action policies are fundamental, hence the importance of reinforcing information. The last studies, as I was saying, that you can see on the web page, and you can actually have access to the last study by ECLAC in this matter, show the gaps that Daniel systematized and mentioned, but it is still deep in terms of poverty and extreme poverty. And as I mentioned you, the case of Uruguay, for example, Afro-descending poverty in Uruguay, for example, virtually triples Afro-descending poverty to the non-Afro-descending. In Brazil, it's doubled. In Colombia, it's 50% greater, and we can continue with those numbers. So census also have shown this deep gap in terms of not only poverty, but also in terms of access to housing, access to water, drainage, power. Now, in terms of child death and maternity death and access of educational system, well, yes, it is true that countries such as Brazil, that for many years had affirmative action policies for Afro-descending access to college and that were able to reduce the gaps. Nevertheless, they were not able to eliminate them. And we also know that when there are political changes, setbacks are produced compared to those achievements. Now, in terms of unemployment, gaps are also big in terms of violence, as Daniel already said. And I'm running out of time, so this is still systematic. This is why, and also to respect my colleagues' time, and to conclude, we would say that in terms of statistic visibilization, we had on one side three urgent channels for this 2020 census round, and not to produce the setbacks that were produced in Colombia and that you know them very well in terms of quantification and characterization of Afro-descending populations. And we have in the region a series of current recommendations where it is not enough to rethink, methodologically rethink the questions that have to be posed, but that it is important to have organizations' participation, Afro-descending organizations' participation in census efforts. And with this, consider everything having to do with the different stages of the census process to guarantee quality information access. And the second challenge has to do with assessing this information that should be permanent in order to incorporate constant improvements and move forward on the analysis, the usage, because yes, it is true that we are still having some constraints in information. It is also true that in the last couple of years, a lot of information has been generated, and there is an underutilization of it. So, democratization process for information has to be elaborated further. And this goes not only with guaranteeing access to it, but also to strengthening national capacities for the usage and analysis of this information. Secondly, it is very important to consider census in the national statistic efforts. This is why it is so important to keep on promoting self-identification in all of the databases. And it is also very important to establish political and technical agreements on the statistical production with racial ethical focus in order to keep on improving the quality of this information. Hence, promotion of debate opportunities between Afro-descending and statistics institutions, specialists, etc., is still quite relevant. Sometimes we celebrate on progress, but quickly, early. So processes could end up being imminent if we do not continue with these processes in a systematic way. And for this, of course, it is very important to keep on strengthening alliances between academic processes, Afro-descending communities, the academia, statistical groups, and to keep on counting with the support of international institutions. To conclude, I would like to reiterate what I said before, that at ECLAC we consider that it is of utmost importance not only to move forward universal policies, move towards universal policies, but the population of Afro-descending communities are not going to be guaranteed if affirmative action policies are not implemented. Those who have enough resources, that have continuity in time, and this is why tax policy turns into a key situation. So that's all on my part. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much, Fabiana. So for those of you who do not know Fabiana, she works at ECLAC in demographics and statistics. She's an expert, and what she just told us about statistical visibilization of Afro-descending communities is amazing. Now I would like to pass the floor to Carlos Biafara. He works in economic development topics and public policies for Afro-descending communities. Before passing the floor to you, I'd like to remind you that on the chat you can find a link that will take you to a Google Docs document where you can incorporate questions and any reactions to what panelists are sharing with us. You can also share information on your organizations. It's an open space for you. So, Carlos, please go ahead. Thank you, Daniel. Good day, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for organizing this event. And I'm going to talk about some aspects related to inequality of opportunity, mainly in this problem caused by COVID-19. And at the end, I'm going to share some reflections on how this could impact tax policy. I'm going to share my screen now, my presentation. I have some data for you. Here we go. So can you see the screen? Yes. So in this sense, I will start with a short introduction trying to consider how these historical inequalities could be related to COVID-19 with affectations due to COVID-19. Then I'm going to present data that Fabiana more or less introduced, a multidimensional poverty in Colombia according to racial index. We're going to see some COVID-19 statistics that are very specific. And at the end, we are going to be sharing some considerations. Well, when we're talking about inequality, even when we're talking about tax policy, we cannot forget that these are one of the most unequal countries in the world. Some studies say that Colombia, in the higher part of income distribution, so in the 1% above, Colombia is the most unequal country in the world. We are a highly unequal country with a very unequal component. In this sense, studies on social mobility and economic studies have proven in the literature that this income inequality affects equal opportunities. So it has effects and significance that affects individuals from having access to certain socially valuable services. So in this sense, Latin America, well, the ethnic and racial groups that are vulnerable are at the center of the exclusion process, and this places them in the lowest area of income distribution. Being there and being poor, well, impacts them in life opportunities. So income inequality, which is a traditional feature in the region, evidently affects ethnic racial groups for being in the lower part of income. So in this sense, I propose that COVID-19 lethality index can be considered as an inequality of opportunities indicator. So, of course, inequality of opportunity related to social biological aspects, long-term ones, that started appearing in the colonial times that affect the most Afro-descending communities, but of course, evidently also reinforced in the present today. So in this sense, I will discuss the current status of inequality for Afro-descending communities in Colombia. We are going to talk about those cumulative stagnancies and what have been impacts of COVID-19 for Afro-descending communities in Colombia. So very specifically, we have here poverty for Colombia for ethnic and racial reasons during 2018 census. As we know, basically there were many mistakes. Yes, there was an underestimation of the Afro-descending community, but census at times are used to measure some variables of interest. And as Fabiana said, evidently, poverty rate for Afro-descending community in Colombia is 56% higher for Afro-descendants than for a national average. And this rate is kept in the main region as well as populated areas. Well, a very important situation here on the methodology of multidimensional poverty is that it allows to break down the index, which is fundamental, evidently, for tax policies. I mean, it allows to see, according to ethnic and racial communities, where each of interest populations have better affectation. So I have ordered here what were the greatest affectations and impacts of these groups according to their incidency. And as we've seen, Afro-descending households have more advocacy in all of the factors related to multidimensional poverty, but evidently is way higher, for example, in informal works, in education, in school stagnancy, access to drinking water in Afro-descending communities, and they are more affected by illiteracy. So most of indicators excluding long-term employment, well, Afro-descendants are impacted the most. So of course, we are facing a structural inequality that evidently affects all of the aspects related to life opportunities for individuals. Now, what has been the rate to COVID-19 influence for Afro-descending community? Here I'm considering the last news report, national data for yesterday, and Afro-descending information is for May 14. So yesterday, for example, we had 3,161,000 cases, and the lethality rate was 2.62. Of every 10 people that die, 2.62 people of them will die. So while Afro-descending population, there was 73,874 two confirmed cases, 2,215 deceased. So the lethality index or rate was 3%. So of 10 people getting sick, 3 people will die. So lethality rate, mortality rate is higher for Afro-descending population, which confirms, of course, a higher impact. This caused that the mortality rate is 15% higher in relation with the national average. So if we were able to break down this indicator, I'm sure per ethnic and racial population compared to Caucasian population, we are of course going to get a larger differentiation in terms of percentage rates in terms of this mortality rate. This of course contrasts with the influence with. So when we consider numbers of confirmed cases in Afro-descending populations is 2.33%, and when we consider incidence in 2.67% is a percentage that's of course related and explained by what Fabiana said. In Colombia, we had a huge problem. We have a difficulty to be able to capture the Afro-descending variable in the health sector, and the census, as we know, was a failure, and this of course makes this number or Afro-descending number that are getting sick cannot be reflected in this impact. However, we have the mortality rate being one indicator measuring the reality of this disease for Afro-descending community. And of course, this is not seen only as an aggregated level. If we consider Afro-descending rates in different cities of the Colombian country, we can see that how serious this is and how Afro-descending communities are affected, with mortality rate that is almost 6%. So in Tumaco, it's virtually above 4%, and it is around, in Quibdó, of around the average, national average. So the aggregate Afro-descending communities, as well as in the most important cities of the Colombian Pacific, are representative for the Afro-descending community. And mortality rates there for COVID-19 is way higher, which means a higher impact in Afro-descending communities because of this pandemic. So what does this mean? Well, evidently, this correlation that could exist between opportunity inequality that basically are instituted and that were instaured since the colonial times, these inequalities in the colonial times as of racism and discrimination. Well, today we see this represented basically in higher effects for Afro-descendants in the midst of this pandemic. And of course, as a result, of the structural racism. So let's see here that there are some aspects, and when I was talking about these sociological aspects that could be affecting Afro-descending communities the most because of coronavirus, well, yes, we have more comorbidities, and these comorbidities are related to socio-environmental aspects that are quite particular of the regions where Afro-descending people located as of the colonial times, the health habits, education, etc. And they are explained by this process of structural inequality. Also, when we have confinement and quarantine, these are also going to have larger affectation for Afro-descending communities. We saw here that we had a more precarious situation in the labor market. And this, of course, derives in a lack of income, higher impact. And of course, this has basically consequences in the type of defenses facing a disease. So the characteristics of Afro-descending community housing have more overcrowding, unhealthy situations that causes higher risks to get the disease. Lack of healthcare means that the risk of death is way higher. And in education, there is a huge impact. The closure of public schools has caused an increase of virtual education. But basically, because of the exclusion that we suffer of internet and more technological options, causes in attendance and school dropout. So to conclude, definitely we think, or I think, that of course, in this short term, in this situation, we are being affected by a pandemic that's having causing a lot of impact. But Afro-descending community for many, many years has been affected by other pandemic that's even harder, which is structural racism. So these two pandemics, structural racism plus COVID-19, are generating basically what we have today, which is a social bomb affecting Afro-descending population, not only in terms of COVID-19, but also in terms of life opportunities. So in this sense, for example, that's why partly the effects of the shutdown in Cali were more aggressive. And if you can see what are the areas, for example, in Cali that have had or that have been affected the most in disorders are the areas where most of the population lives, more of where the Afro-descending community lives. This has a lot of consequences for tax policy. This has a lot of implications and consequences. We cannot think that we cannot think in terms of efficiency of tax policy by denying the possibilities of these groups that have been historically marginalized to improve their capacities. Efficiency, of course, of public policy is related to these groups, historically more discriminated, be able to improve capacities to increase, of course, general productiveness of economy. So I don't really believe about this dichotomy between efficiency and human rights. Evidently, efficiency also implies inclusion of these historically discriminated groups. And we've seen that facing this emergency of COVID-19, well, Afro-descending communities are being affected the most, and this brings general loss to economy as a whole. But later on, we can continue discussing this. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Carlos, for your presentation. And we will address most of the topics that you mentioned. Now, since we don't have enough time, I'm going to pass the floor to Sofia Garzon. Sofia is an activist of Black communities process, and she works at the Observatory of Violence Based Against Gender of Afro-descending communities. And she also works at the Black Feminist Fund. So, Sofia, please go ahead. So first of all, I'd like to thank the effort of organizations and people that make it that make possible this will group so we can discuss these topics. Now, to start, the global context has shown very clearly that we need tax policy measures that are progressive and expansive so that food and social protection is not deepened. Now, one thing would be tax and expansive policy, and a very different one would be impacts and how the materialization of these measures aim to provide social equality. They have a basis that maybe we should discuss when it comes to racial ethnicity. And something that Fabiana and Carlos mentioned, however, they haven't elaborated. And this has to do with the fact that state nation as a concept is closely rooted and based from race as a social construct. So state nation needs racism. And to this extent, it needs racism as a marker that organizes the way in which resources are used, consumed, and transformed. And now resources are the territories where we live. Resources are the relationships that we establish with those resources, and resources are even our bodies, right? And to that extent, they are managing these resources the way I just introduced it. So this is the way Black territoriality, Black bodies are managed. So this is a state nation that under a modern Western mentality affects the community and destroyed it to build societies with individuals that respond to lesser civic values. So starting from this point or this criteria that has to do with the tax policy that we need in order to not support anymore an intrinsically racist country. So tax policies are elements related to a state and well-being idea that have given, and Carlos and Fabiana have given very clear explanation of this. This is one that has kept Black people at the margin, at the limit of it. But with the exception of those of us quite fortunate that are here today. But they do not consider the Afro-descending community that inhabits the earth. So we need to reflect what it means when there is a tax policy that offers a state of well-being, when we know that there are institutions that are not modifying this well-being idea for it to be related and to respect other ways of life, such as the ones that we can evidence in plural contexts, or the ones that we can evidence in contexts where brothers and sisters live, those who have been displaced by projects and policies of development, and that have been created not to sustain life, informal economy. So we have data and indicators that talk about the amount of activities necessary to leave the poverty threshold. So Colombia needs around 13 generations studying in order to leave poverty conditions. We have information that also indicates that Black population in Latin America and African nations are enlarging the volume of the economy that's characterized as informal. And because of this, it is understood that impoverishment on one side and informality that we work with on the other creates a scenario of justification for us to have a development plan after the other here in Colombia, but also in any other part of the world, being that it's in our behalf and in order to improve our material livelihood. And it is necessary to have a private sector grown and the exterior policy that makes investment grow without or with exemption, so that we can be part of that population that increases their productive populations to keep on generating growth to this country, where the truth is that this country, just as most of them in the global south, most of them in Black Africa, are the supporters, the net supporters of capital, of the public debt. So, with the payment of our resources, natural resources, with the payment of not being able to choose our future, our present, it's with that the financial system robust and they still generate updates to those unequal policies that you were talking about. So, it's important to add, or I'd like to readdress the topic of the tax policy challenges from a Pan-African point of view. And for this, I would like to stress on two instruments that I find quite interesting because of the historical scope. One is the Declaration of Rio Combage, and the other one is a letter with recommendations that African feminists group did when all of this situation of searching for human aid so that COVID wouldn't turn into another business, as the end of the conflict was in Colombia, as poverty becomes at the end of the day in Colombia, in order to recommend states how to have a more efficient action in terms of guaranteeing that there is racial equality and to guarantee that there is an invitation to imagine economy beyond, like reinventing it. That is the challenge that I'd like to share with you today. So they do several recommendations. I am going to focus on 7 of them very quickly. So the first one is the one that was more or less readdressed by Fabiana, and that we have insisted from the African women movement, and that accompanies these proposals to rethink development policies. And even when my sisters say this, I would say that we have to particularly consider local strategies out there to satisfy and sustain life. So we don't have indicators, nor data, nor information saying how we could quantify that network, support network that has supported Afro-descending life in terms of pandemic. How much Afro-Colombian money did they save? What was the organization and capacity that was deployed, and at a community level that was deployed to guarantee food, health, services to the families that were with all of their members at home sick? Because let's say that I have evidence of entire families that got sick with COVID. I mean, part of informal market, they didn't have any more income. So that's not monetized. If it is, yes, the income that the Colombian state has asked to financial institutions or debt that the Colombian state had, but we don't have the accounting and how this network, support network, resulted in the programs of help that were deployed. And this would be an indicator that would act as a countermeasure of what already exists. And that should be part of an accounting that helps us push what we are understanding as an economic policy, which is something that African feminists are already working on. So the functioning of social protection system beyond subsidies to demand and monetary transference. I mean, we don't need for people to say that they're going to spend ports or customs places, or they're going to increase Colombian areas, or there are more assistance programs, right? Because the right to health, the right to education, that ends up being paid for, and we need to pay to have access to those rights. So instead of us having the right to receive those for free, they end up being monetized as a service. So we have to pay for it so we can have access to any sort of implementation of a development of this type of policies, of this type of development policy, sorry. A third point has to do with the fact that knowledge is a merchandise. So COVID is not going to be the only pandemic that we're going to have to go through, because we are again in that threshold that we already crossed, where climate injustice is going to truly charge and will want to collect, because of the way we have affected ecosystems. So the way it has happened with the HIV, with AIDS, with Ebola, we cannot allow that intellectual property around the knowledge that could save lives to just run from our hands. So one recommendation is for there not to be intellectual property around knowledge that saves lives. And this is, of course, a cross-sectional aspect that's important to bring. I already mentioned the fourth point, which is something that I already mentioned, which is how, with growth of public debt at a global level, and in this sense, how the growth of public debt for the global south and for Black Africa, this means still reducing autonomy in order to define their tax policy, their tax collection policy, and to this extent, readdress a discussion that's not old and that's updated once again, and one that having an expansion or an extension on the debt payment, there should be an elimination of that debt. We cannot say, well, no, that's not realistic. No, we need to have ideas and imagine what we should do for this to be an option. And the sixth has to do with veto power, facing financing projects that are established on our name, such as the tax reform that was abusively called a solidary and sustainable one, that reminds a meme of the three people that are the business person, the worker, and the person in precarious situation. And the business person tell to the worker with their only plate to, of course, the plate is almost empty, and the business person has a full plate, you know? And that's how direct investment of foreign origin happens, you know. And the last point has to do with recognizing the value, not only the economic value, but also the social, cultural, and political value to care system. Women are sustaining life, but the care system cannot be exclusively monetized, which is something that the Spanish current, Argentinian current, on how the care system is considered, but that we have to locally ask for what are we referring to when we're talking about care, and what are the dimensions of that care, of that life preservation, not only human life, not only human life. And this is why we need to leave the currents of the global north type of care. And we need to ask ourselves, what are the values in social, political, and cultural systems of having a care system? And last but not least, remembering that there is a huge marginalization and inclusion, and that we are particularly in this historical time in Colombia, but also in the world, because of what the current health crisis meant. And we can reimagine, we can go beyond, you know? So, to this extent, I would invite you to discuss works such as Caroline Hussein, Ara Mancino, Devon Hale, Lepolo, all of them are black economists of international finances that are imagining a world beyond conventional measures of development. And this way, deciding that in practice, support networks that held Black lives in these times of pandemics, but that have kept it alive during these centuries of life in this continent, in 170 years of Republican life. And these thinkers and these local networks are necessary to considered with a new policy program with different economy, politics, and policies. So thank you so much for your attention, and that's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much for your presentation to invite us to rethink economy. Well, and as last presentation, I would like to pass the floor to Linnea Andrade. Before passing the floor to Linnea, I just wanted to remind you once again that you have the Google Doc document available for you so that you can include your comments, your organization's info, and everything having to do with this presentation. So Aline is a lawyer. She is a teacher and she's a doctor of law in Sao Paulo's University. She's also received studies in Los Angeles University. Aline, please. Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I would like to thank you for inviting me. I would like to say hello to everyone, Fabiana. Well, the importance here is talking about resistance, Black people in Latin America, and especially today, it is important to remember our brothers and sisters Afro-Colombian. We are part of the diaspora here in Brazil. We, since May 13, have been fighting. We have denounced the situation in Brazil. We know that Brazil was the only country that abolished slavery not so long ago. This is why we have come here to talk about our fight. Especially, we know that little by little, more organizations have been created to be able to fight this situation in Brazil. So that's why I'm so glad to have been invited to talk about tax policy, the racial situation, because we are at a time in Brazil that's quite particular, because the tax policy actually does not help having any progress in terms of Black communities. We don't see that the Constitution is being respected in this sense. Actually, since 1988, we saw that at last the treaty to abolish slavery was signed. Before that, we hadn't included Black communities as a part of the Brazilian community. They hadn't been integrated. And we also know that most of poor people, 70% of them, are part of the Black population in Brazil, and more than 60% of people in jails are also from Black community, and more of the 40% of people, especially that do not have any sort of benefit, social security, are also belonging to the Black community, and they're having problems in terms of being able to acquire assets. And I can also tell you that supposedly many times we are killed because of the supposed war against the drugs. And we always hear there are a lot of attacks against Black community every 2 or 3 minutes. Someone of color dies. So we have high violence index and feminicides also in our population. A Black woman has 3 times more probability to be murdered because of this feminine violence compared to a Caucasian woman. And we also are less protected by law. However, I wanted to share what are the conditions that we are on, especially in all of the country. We have 56% of the Brazilian population being of color. So here I just want to tell you that statistics do not lie. Of course, the population is still in expansion, and here we have a time where we can revert the situation. There are a lot of people that before being called of two origins, they were called biracial. And many times, because of this stigma, we know that the black stigma is also a situation that's presented and it generates higher violence indexes and rates. Now, the work of social movements, especially, helped us generate a black movement from the moment where slavery was abolished. We have a lot of Quilombo community people that are fighting in order to be able to defend themselves. We know that also most of indigenous populations that we've heard in the beginning of 20th century are part of the Black evolution, but we are still part of a population that's in poverty. We start with more movements since the 70s, and we have also started to denounce this inequality, especially as of the reforms of the Constitution. In this reform, we want to acknowledge discrimination. And once again, we want to acknowledge what's the theory that the Brazilian state to promote racial equality. Our constitution many times forgets about these Brazilian objectives that have as a country to promote a free society, a plural society, to fight poverty, and to talk about respect for human rights, and also to fight discrimination. Of course, this also has brought to a series of actions on behalf of the government, the Brazilian state, but we still need to carry out further actions to be able to achieve racial equality. One of these actions is valuing the different ethnic groups, not only in Brazil, but also, well, not only in Black, but also we have indigenous populations. But we know that because of different genocides, we are less and less. We know that there are not only indigenous people, we have a huge variety of indigenous languages, and especially in a large part of the territory. So that's why we need to take into account that according to what we have today in the Constitution, in theory, Brazil will have to promote racial equality. We also know that racism per se was classified as a crime. It was also guaranteed the right to delimit indigenous territories and of Quilombo in the Constitution, as I told you, of Brazil. And this is the same situation that our Colombian brothers have. We are in this type of situations. And as such, all of this was stated in the Constitution. It took a long time, but in the tax budget, we didn't have this type of budget for this type of actions. And during the 90s, we had more territories, as I said, Quilombo territory. We also started having more Brazilian space. We also had the Black movement that started having affirmative action in this sense. And in this way, we were able to do a massive movement so that we as citizens were able to be pro-life. We had Quilombo leaders that were promoting us in these actions against slavery in Brazil. We had that more than 300 initiatives, but we also had certain defeats. And after independence, we were able to banish the Portuguese and Irish government. We started with this type of movement. And we know that at the end of the day, as of the 20th in Brazil, we started asking racial equality, which has affirmative actions in order to also have labor equality, participation in public tenders and biddings. In Brazil, most of acquisitions are done through tenders, and many situations having to do with us being able to enter into the bidding process and to have positions in political life. We also had to eliminate this type of racial stigmas that existed. Now, this action was used as a platform, and as of 2000, we also had a conference in which first, at an international level, it was acknowledged that the Brazilian state was a racist state, and as so we needed to eliminate the situation. This is why before the world, Brazil had to to strip from this label that it was a racial democracy and that it was doing a racial distinction, because there were always legal barriers that prevented this equality to exist. Even Black culture was criminalized. This is a situation that started increasing, and then it started expanding in Latin America. Especially today, we've had this constraint in the fact that there is no criminalization anymore, nor for Black culture, nor for any other culture. We also had two Black Brazilian movements. And I say that these are Black movements in plural. I'm talking about several of them. We have feminist movements, Black movements, movements to have access to higher education, preparation in general, so we can be admitted into college. We have rural movements, Quilombo movements, and also for the general development, so that we can have access to housing, so we can have access to properties and to be able to purchase land. There has been a huge mobilization to improve public justice. The first time that we had the budget for this type of actions was in 2003, where we saw that we needed to have access to all of these funds so that we could generate and raise more awareness. We needed to organize conferences in these matters, and we needed to have more geographic expansion through the different municipalities, different states, so we could have more social participation and we could start developing public policies. And what we did was just reaching certain achievements. Some of them are very well known by you in terms of education, where of course we also see once again that everything was done through these activities of affirmative action, through in terms of education and Brazilian colleges. Actually, around 20% of students, this is an approximate, then 30 and 50%. And little by little, very proportionately, Black community had access to education. This is a proportional calculation that I'm trying to do in average, but at least it was access of 20% of Black people to Brazilian colleges. It's kind of funny to discuss these numbers outside of the Brazilian context, but normally, the school system was quite elitist. It was quite hard to have access to schools, and we know that it is quite hard because they did all sorts of tests. They wanted for competencies that didn't have to do with anything, so it was very hard to have access to this. And before, only 3% of Black population would have access to education before these affirmative actions. To have access to public education, not only for Black people, also for some indigenous populations, depending on the Brazilian state. So once again, we're talking about Quilombo people, and there was also certain parallel actions in order to be able to have access to this public tender, especially at a federal level. So there was a huge controversy in Brazil. Actually, there are some areas in which there are still certain controversies. Especially, I was attacked. I was personally attacked because of a policy. And we then started appealing a little bit more to proportional quotas so that we could have access to more policies to acknowledge territories of, as I said, the Quilombos and other specific programs for the participations that we have in Brazil. There's something called the unique health system. There had to be a reform in this system also, because the Black population is the one that suffers the most for the diseases. We have heart diseases, high blood pressure, any sort of diseases that we get the most, diabetes, all of these type of diseases that need a follow-up, at least with primary basic care. We've also reinforced policies, especially if we start thinking, for example, what used to happen in African story in public schools. Well, we, as a reflection of that, started implementing some public policies to acknowledge Quilombo territory, as I said, and especially to have an element to water in remote places. But we could not always allow for violence to be reduced. In 2013, as I mentioned, we had Lula's administration and then other administrations where we started having a poverty reduction because there were actions that were carried out way more seriously. There was a universal policy so that we could address directly Black communities to address this poverty situation, especially those who were in a group of extreme poverty. And especially because we started seeing that there were certain control measures specifically against some Black groups. There was even a point where we were able to break a record where population of Black prisoners was quite high. We also had a second wave of violence, specifically against our population. The number of Black people that were murdered increased a lot. Today, we started having more access to positions, government positions, especially as of what happened with Bolsonaro after 2006.
Isso já começou no governo Temer.
We also know that virtually we started with these actions as well as with Temer administration, and the government started taking more tax measures and where the limits for certain social groups are established. But well, there was also some opening in terms of health, education. Those have been the topics, and Bolsonaro's government, after having some progress, basically cut back budget, eliminated these resources, and now, well, what is happening? We have a right that was supposedly guaranteed, but there are no resources to guarantee. So I find it perverse from Bolsonaro's administration. And there are many organizations that are fighting right now because we are trying to research so we can produce more data. However, we know that there are a lot of racial problems because of these budget cutbacks. Tax budget is completely encapsulated. There are many sectors of the population that do not understand very well how budget works, regardless of the action that we carry out, whether it's through public denounces, other type of service, we haven't been able to recover this budget. And well, this is one of the realities that we have in Brazil today. We know that budgets are approved until the end of the year. This generates some problems. These are matters that are stipulated in the Constitution. In April and in May, we had more or less budgets already approved. But you know that we have this for all type of situations such as housing, education, health, but not necessarily for our actions. And now for the first time in Brazil, 10 years ago, as I already mentioned, in 2020, because of the pandemic, there was no census. The budget was not approved to go over census. And here, what we're trying to do is to do it mandatorily, because we need to know specifically what are the statistics of the population. For the first time, the government just did not include this option as a part of their budget, as a part of their fiscal budget. We also know that because of COVID, we need to recalculate numbers of the census. 40% of Black people, more or less, die because of COVID and also because of lack of health services, which is a higher percentage of white people.
Junto com diversas organizações, inclusive, faz uma campanha hoje pedindo.
I will back to a platform, which is the Black Coalition, which is carrying out campaigns today in order to be able to get more vaccines, more food. And due to this platform, we were able to launch further actions so that many Brazilians leave this extreme poverty. because Brazil, at the end of the day, just forgot that they had to have a decent policy. We needed this decent policy. And you cannot buy different inputs uh, as easily. We know that, especially with resources and taxes that Brazilians buy, we could get this type of food. However, today we are in a situation of a health crisis, and we know that the type of budget that was used before for these actions now is being destined specifically for this type of health crisis products, but we are forgetting all of the actions and budgets required to be able to help Black community. Actually, right now we are mourning because of all of the deaths that have been because of COVID, especially because we know that all of this represents a setback of everything that we've achieved in the country. And it also generates solidarity on behalf of our people, not only with ourselves, but with the links of with other international societies. And I also want to talk about the good thing. It is great to see how the Brazilian population and Latin American population is united facing the situation. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much for your attention. So we only have 14 minutes in this session. We have to cut at 5:30. So we need 5 minutes in order to be able to have a conclusion space and to have a graphic illustration that has happened throughout this session. So we only have 8 minutes to go over questions. So I'm going to start. I want to propose 3 questions. The first one is focused to Fabiana and Carlos, and the other one is for Celine and Sofia. The question that I have for Fabiana and Carlos has to do with color. And I was looking at Fabiana's presentation that was referring to including questions related to self-recognition in administrative databases, in census, and in all of the statistical national system of the region. So my question is, if this recognition is included in the self-recognition questions. So in some way, this invisibilizes maybe this racial discrimination and its relationship with color, in the sense that part of the academic literature on racism in the region, it says that it does not necessarily pursues racial things, but because of the color of the skin. So those who are exposed to racism the most are the ones that have a darker color because they are related to Afro descendants. So without this conversation on data, we are not neglecting a discussion based on color. So this is the first thing I can think of, especially when we can consider a relationship between the disparity that the pandemic has had in territory or in communities that are mostly Afro-descending. But we don't do those exercises related to, for example, how the pandemic has affected the community or the Afro-descending community when we disaggregate it in color terms. So in the case of Sofia, the question has to do with this type of structural transformations and that in some way invite to subvert status quo in terms of power distribution. So Sofia was talking about veto power in terms of tax reforms or tax collection reforms when they were done on behalf of the Afro-descending matters. And we also have intellectual property, or that way that it could save lives. In the case of Aline, there was a conversation there on recognizing the state as a racist action. So recognizing state racism and how the state also has in its structure many levels that go beyond the racial supremacy that ends up affecting Afro-descending people. So my question here is, how can communities how can Afro-descending people in the region get the power in terms of power in general to be able to reach this type of radical transformation that do not have anything to do with just reforms, but just having to do with these structures to be able to have survival of Afro-descending communities and Black people in the region. And last but not least, for everyone, I don't have enough time, has to do with what brought us here today, especially what has to do with principles and guidelines. How do you think that these principles and guidelines on human rights and tax policy could contribute to improving those inequality gaps that affect Afro-descending people in Latin America? Better put, how this conversation on principles and guidelines could have a result, a pact that's more substantial. I know that it is a lot, but now I pass the floor to anyone that wants to answer.
Sí, Carlos.
I want to say something and it's not related to the question. I think Fabiana has to answer that, yes. But I'm going to propose some elements that I find fundamental when we are talking about tax policy for Afro-descending communities. So I want to propose some elements very quickly. The first one is that definitely inequality has implications that affect economic growth. There is a consensus so that inequality will slow down economic growth long term. What does this mean? Well, the lack of functionality of human capital that, of course, affects certain populations and determines higher productivity long term. This means a final equality. So this is gonna cause that at the end of the day, you have to use tax mechanisms to balance the quality of income as a product of the drop on commodities. However, of course, this tax policy that's practiced for all of the countries in the world in such a way has to be done under a principle of distributive equality. And I think that in the case of Colombia and in the case of most of Latin American countries, this is what we haven't had, distributive equality or equity in tax policies. So in this sense, an affirmative action is a fundamental principle of this distributive characteristic. So yes, evidently these groups that were discriminated need better conditions, better resources for equality. And of course, it's going to go back to higher economic growth. So that's why I was saying that there was no dichotomy between human development policies and efficiency policies. I also find important to show how these local processes are important for population to design public policies. However, I don't have only one cosmovision for Afro-descendings. We need to consider that Afro-descending community is quite heterogeneous here in Colombia. It's quite heterogeneous. So evidently we need to respect each population, but always taking into account there's a lot of heterogeneity. One thing would be Black population of the Colombian Pacific. Another thing would be populations in most of the cities, despite many of them could have come from the Colombian Pacific or having family members there. And there are some myths in tax policy in Colombia. Many years there was a huge amount of public policies creation, and they turned into a fad in the rest of the world for Afro-descending communities, national development plans. However, this is not included in budgeting. And what we have today is that the programs for Afro communities have to be financed by international cooperation beyond some affirmative actions that exist, very small ones. So definitely we need a distributive equality in tax policy. Perfect, Fabiana. Well, yes, thank you so much, Danielle. Your question is quite relevant. So, I think that we have to remember that census, service, registrations are not designed to measure racial discrimination. And this is important to take into account because certainly, if I wanted to measure racial aspects, I will need to have instruments for that. But information sources will give us the basis in order to establish policies. And in this sense, criteria of self recognition is coherent with a perspective of human rights. So, yes, it's true that there are studies that, and even using colors, that have proven that the darker the skin, then the greater inequality is. So, we, from this panel and from institutionality and from considering public policy, we believe that we need to respect this right focus. It is also true that self identification has biases because depending on how I ask a question, how I determine categories, then I'm going to have different populations. And in this sense, this is why we insist that when gathering this information, it is very important to have the participation and how we work with data collection, taking into account all of production phases for information, and not only just asking a question in such a way that why and what for self unification is, and try to prevent those biases. On the other part, too, finally, beyond the problems that information presents, just as Carlos mentioned, the information that we have is also useful to show gaps and the inequalities. Even with the constraints, it has allowed to show those inequalities. And the third element that I want to mention has to do with the fact that in these statistical instruments, I mean, yes, they are the basis to establish or distribute resource allocation and many other decisions in terms of public policies. It is not census nor the registration is the one that's going to grant a benefit to a person. So here Eileen can even mention that mechanisms to grant a scholarship, for example, an Afro-descendant scholarship is not established from census. At census, someone established the budget, but not the direct allocation of a state benefit. And this is why we insist and we promote self-identification for it to be promoted with the most quality standards possible. This in terms of information. But I wanted to also reference, and because of the presentation that Sofia shared, because at ECLAC, our executive secretary has insisted that, especially right now in this crisis, if we do not rethink development models, these inequality gaps won't eliminate, not even with affirmative action policies. So if there's no deep transformation in what determines this structural inequality, where racism is one of the powerful dimensions that we have in this structural inequality matrix. If we do not change development models, we won't be able to achieve the equality and the equity that we are looking for. And in this sense, it is also important to elaborate on our democracies moving towards true plurinational democracies. Thank you, Fabiana. I don't know if Aline or Sofia have any comments. We don't have that much time. I just want to remember that I think that here we also know that in general, the Brazilian state is racist, and we are working to eliminate this racial supremacism because of what has been going on in the story of Brazil. It is at the service of racism, of supremacy. And there are also institutions that supposedly have as a purpose to distribute Black indigenous peoples and other countries that historically have been discriminated. This has been a part, unfortunately, of the reality of our constitution. And it is also part of an aware option that we have. And of course, that's how these privileges have been kept against our population. So I think that the state is racist, yes, especially with all of the situations. Even if we have a diverse and plural country, we are still being so racist. And this, of course, also generates a lot of difficulties. This is why we need to keep on fighting in order to reach racial equity. But we are in a situation of exclusion, of racism, even a chauvinistic one. We are in a patriarchy. I don't know if in these systems we could go to a situation that's kind of different to this. But of course, it is a situation where the system is wrong. And we need to generate a society that's outside of this capitalist and exclusive um, environment. Sorry, you're muted. Thank you. Yes, very quickly. I think that it has to do with what the panel members said. Very concretely, I can say that this power changes is simultaneous. I mean, if my eyes cannot see it, I cannot really imagine it. But here at the north of the Cauca, that's where I've lived for 6 years, and I can see how the women's organization and how political growth of organizations of the wide range that Black people are, it is more convinced of the need to concern for productively working together, cooperating, exchanging political education processes that include rethinking the state. So I can see that there are visible indicators, more women that go to municipal positions, and women that not only want to be those who organize the candidates roster for political parties voting, but that there is an elections, but that there is a deepening of awareness that we can propose for the region, for indigenous peoples, for peasants, for unions, for business people in the region, and we can talk to them and we can say we have to transform the way we're doing things because it is not enough to widen areas because we need to talk about sustainable development. And if we want to talk about territories that promote climate justice, all of these situations are happening in that territory. And I know that they're also happening in some places of Cordoba, of Quito, of Agua Blanca district, of Bolivar. So, yes, they don't have the visibility that they had, but I think that there are experiences that have to be known, articulated, so that they materialize this redistribution of power that we are seeing, and to protect them so that they are not institutionalized and so that they are able to have the impact that we want them to have. And it is that they need to mean a transformation for people's lives. So I see children grow in other contexts where there's more respect for their lives, where they know that it's best to eat a tomato that was grown in their backyard than one that comes God knows where. So that has been grown God knows how. So these have an impact that are not the macro that we are used to reflect on, but that they allow to enable a different imagination to think about these democratic areas that we are inviting you and that we are committing to. With all of these exercises and with all of these proposals and strategies as a letter for tax principles for the warranty and realization of human rights. Very quickly. So I asked Carolina Mota if she can share the graphic illustration of the event so we can close it. It is a very complex summary. And basically, it aims to this reflection on how we have readdressed the way challenges in terms of guaranteeing of human rights in the Afro-descending community in the region is still huge, and how either way introduced in a conversation, we need to rethink the tax policy in the state. We need to change this conversation to a radical conversation in the state, which is indispensable to be able to overcome these inequality gaps. And with this, we close. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you for joining us in these different channels.
Muchas gracias, hasta pronto.
Gracias, hasta luego.
¿Sabes cuál es la relación entre la política fiscal y los derechos humanos? Los derechos humanos son los derechos que toda persona tiene por existir. La política fiscal es la forma en la que el gobierno obtiene los recursos para financiarse y cómo los gasta después. Esta política puede promover o generar retrocesos en la garantía de los derechos humanos. En América Latina, la región más desigual en el mundo, durante la pandemia por COVID-19, 73 multimillonarios aumentaron su fortuna en $42,000 millones, mientras se estima que 52 millones de personas ya han entrado en la pobreza. Esto demuestra que los países de América Latina no están cumpliendo con los acuerdos internacionales de derechos humanos que suscribieron. Si estos acuerdos internacionales fueran cumplidos, la política fiscal estaría al servicio de las personas y sus derechos en vez de restringirlos, que es lo que sucede hoy en la región. Con eso en mente, 7 organizaciones en América Latina se propusieron analizar estos acuerdos internacionales y aclarar cuáles son las implicaciones en derechos en materia de política fiscal. Así surgen los 15 principios de derechos humanos en la política fiscal, que al ser aplicados por los gobiernos asegurarían que las políticas fiscales estén al servicio de los derechos. Algunas de las ideas en el documento aclaran que el Estado necesita recaudar impuestos de manera justa, de forma que los más ricos contribuyan más. Que las mujeres, las personas afrodescendientes, los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades que han sufrido discriminaciones deben tener prioridad en las decisiones del gasto. Y que la política fiscal debe ser transparente, participativa y sujeta a la rendición de cuentas. Si quieres saber más, visita nuestro sitio web.